All right, we're recording live right now. Uh, my name is Herbert,
And I'm Heather.
and welcome to the Random Fandom Zone podcast. And so I know it's been a little bit of a while since we've been on air, but we're back and even better. And if you notice, we got some uniforms on. So before we dive into the episode we're talking about today, anything you want to talk about?
How have you been? How's your day?
Oh, good, good. I got up. I was able to do a little bit of work. Went outside. Actually, they have this big rig thing going on in Nacogdoches. I got to see Bigfoot, the big truck with like tires bigger than taller than you, and so they were auctioning out stuff. It's something for charity. They have No McCoy playing a concert tonight. I guess it's a free concert because they're doing like a. I'm not sure. I'm really not sure how they're making any money off of that. Well, how about you? How was your day?
It was cool. Guess what? Oh my, and I found out today
What?
that we are getting a McAllister's and a Chipotle.
Oh, well, awesome.
Yeah. I'm very
Chipotle.
excited.
Yeah, Chipotle has had a little bit of negativity on TikTok because of portion sizing and cost. Like back in the day,
It's not cheap. It's not.
you could get like a decent sized burrito or bowl or taco. I don't know for $6, $7, and now it's like $12,
Yeah.
and they're skimping on the protein.
But isn't that like everywhere? Like price like I don't know.
Yeah, I got a sorry, I got the Burger King chicken sandwich the other day, and I know it's about an inch shorter than it used to be
Yeah.
because it's a smaller bun for sure. Maybe the patty's about the same size, so that's probably better in some ways, but they've kept it almost the same price. So I think what they call it, shrinkflation has happened as well. So and if we think about the inflation they had in 1987, I think that's kind of interesting in a lot of aspects. So here we go. This is
So our
a
episode this week is Naked Now, which air date was October 5th, 1987.
1987. That's what I
So
was thinking.
I started watching in like 89. I probably started with about the fourth season. So, or third or fourth. So by the time I saw this, it was kind of like a prequel for me. I was kind of, yeah, I wasn't starting like on season one when I first started watching Star Trek. I was in like three or four. So when in fact, I rented this from Hastings because I was such a fan and I wanted to see and back then you couldn't just stream stuff. So if you wanted to see the old episodes, I rented it with my cousin Rhonda.
Yeah, I think back to October 3rd. Golly, I mean, we're almost, well, not quite at the anniversary
Yeah, we're
date
close.
date of that. Um, that tells me that the it started sometime in September. I guess that's when the Next Generation came out, like on like the next week over.
Because it was like the third aired episode, but it was really the first episode or the second episode in terms of like plot line. You have Encounter at Farpoint and then The Naked Now.
Yes.
That's kind of where it sits.
Yes. And so I think in a lot of aspects that it is interesting. Let me pull it up again real quick, just to.
It was directed by Paul Lynch, who also directed First Duty, 11001001, Unnatural Selection, A Matter of Time. He also directed episodes of Twilight Zone, Murder She Wrote, Sliders, Xena, Moonlighting. So that was our
an,
director.
an active TV career for sure.
And it was
Um,
written by DC Fortuna, who actually that was a pseudonym for Michelle Bingham. I'm
yes.
sorry. Yeah, yeah. And she wrote a lot and she was, I think, kind of responsible for them using Q more
A- And
ultimately.
and the reason why she went by DC because they didn't want to use a woman's name back in 1966.
Yes, and she did have some kind of falling out with Gene Roddenberry. She actually wrote some episodes of Babylon 5
Yeah.
and
And
other things as well.
it has Gene Roddenberry as a writer. I'm curious how much he wrote, and then John D.F. Black on there as well. So
I think because Star Trek, come on, let's be like, you have the first season and it kind of does a bit of a reset. In some ways, it's kind of a different show. And I think her ideas are ones they ultimately kind of ended up going with more, even though she was already gone. Um,
And it's interesting the stars they have: Patrick Stewart, Jonathan Frakes, and LeVar Burton. That's interesting. Uh, the Prince Spiner is not on there. Uh,
and that's another point in this episode. I don't know if we should like go through it, but like I find because Brent also says they wanted him for Riker, and he didn't want to be Riker. And he wanted to be Data, and they kept telling him Data would be just like a boring, static, stock. Like no one would want to be Data. You'll get so bored with Data. And even in Naked Now, our second episode, Data's a jewel of a character. Like Data is so like there's so much potential in Data, and Brent is playing it like a master. Like yeah, so I
well,
think I don't know who was telling him that, but like Data is obviously the character to be, even in the second episode.
if you look at this episode and like the seventh series or the movies, um, it's almost like an arc because he is very android-ish in this episode.
Yes, but
Uh,
he's androidish, but we're also starting to get like the misunderstandings and figures of speech and
Now, I would okay if he knew all that stuff. I think he would understand, some type of colloquialism from human literature. Because if AI that we have that came out 2 years ago almost can go through there and figure out this, he supposedly had all the. He is basically what AI was before. All this information. He's a large language. He's a walking large language model back then, and basically Newly and Soon inputted all the records and didn't they put the records of people's brains in there also, into
yeah, of all the colonists.
all the colonists on there. So it had a lot of access to data, to understanding things. And but in some aspects, the thing that I always kind of question is how he got to be a lieutenant commander in Starfleet, because that's if you don't know ranks in the military, uh, we're getting to the point that's not a junior officer, that's a senior officer, and a lieutenant commander in Star Trek is equivalent. Well, we go through the ranks. You got ensign, you got lieutenant junior grade, lieutenant senior grade, and lieutenant commander. So if we do this in the regular, like say the Army, you have first lieutenant, second lieutenant, captain, major. Then a commander is a lieutenant colonel, and then the captain is basically the colonel. So how did he get to be a senior officer in in Starfleet? Because you know normally you had to pass all the academic records and all these other things according to Wesley later on. And um, and I guess the other question, and they kind of talk about, why did you do that? I had knew as soon as I had so much more hope for you anyway. So there's a lot of questions I can go back and ask. Why is this android? I can understand maybe a lieutenant, but a lieutenant.
I think he would be very kind of. I think he would be very good at Starfleet. Like
Well, oh, how many years do you think
he
he's?
knows all the things. He would do them correctly every time. He would always follow protocol.
Okay, we got a background on Riker's commands before. We got a background on Picard, Stargazer. I don't think we got it.
No,
What
no, we
ships?
don't get a lot. We get the Starfleet officers found him, and he just thought, "Oh, you're Starfleet officers. You found me. I'll do Starfleet." But we don't get like any of his other commands, any of his other places that he served, or yeah,
Because
how he kind of went up the ranks. I don't think we really get from Data.
when we run into Lore later on, he says, "Well, I get a similar suit as you." He said, "Well, I think he said he spent 15 years going through Starfleet and the ranks. So let's say he went 4 years in the academy, because we're not going to take the Star Trek movie where the 2009 one where we we got Spock already in Starfleet, and Captain Kirk comes in there as a cadet and becomes captain. It makes that was the biggest problem I had with that was the rank system. You don't jump into the captain anyway. So it's just a lot. So he spent, let's say he spent 4 years in Starfleet Academy.
But Data could have spent less.
Possibly, but
Data could have done it maybe in 3 or 2. I don't know.
but you still got to go through to like classes where you got to get skill sets. And again, maybe you can learn piloting faster and engineering faster or whatever. But let's just say he did 4 years. All right, so he's got like he spent 11 years on starships, and we don't, and this is the android we have after 11 years. What did the other people do? Did they never talk to him? Anyways, I go on and on, but you know what? At some point, you got to
Well, no, 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 no.
suspend.
You're right, and I think the answer to that, which is the answer to a lot of things, is we needed a good character that we could see grow for the show. So if we started with a Data who kind of showed us all of like how you really would be after interacting with humans for over a decade, that's not as much fun of a Data.
No, no, and that's why I'm saying if he would have started off as an ensign,
So maybe he should have started like Geordi should have been the science officer and he should have been Geordi.
yes, like he would have started off as an ensign or maybe a lieutenant junior grade. This is a second ship or something
Yeah,
where he's still
second ship
developing.
or something like that. Or it could have
But
been interesting for him to be right out of the academy and Picard to have chosen this android that's kind of a new thing of how he's going to work. And Picard's like, yeah, I'll take him.
but I think Gene Roddenberry, I don't know if it's for sure, but I guess he wanted him as second, and you know, also he's second in command. After I mean, there's Picard, Riker, and him. He's third in command basically. So anyway, so which is a lot of things are interesting. A lot of things are interesting. So
So another
um,
thing I liked about this episode, I don't know, and I don't know how it was for you watching it, what you thought when you first watched it, or your reaction. But of course, because I was right at that age, I don't know, was I 13, 14? Anyway, where it was kind of for me being a young adolescent girl, it was kind of like a little bit naughty. Like it was like being drunk, and there's naughty Data Tasha scenes, and so that was another reason that I really this episode was always one of my favorites. Troy Riker scenes, it was like a little bit like ooh. So yeah,
as
Picard Beverly scenes, it was kind of choice because it was a little bit naughty.
yeah, so kind of it's interesting the stills that they've got
And it's
off the
also interesting that like the levels that they all react to whatever's going on are very different. Like some of them just go, like Tasha's like just walking down the Enterprise quarters, grabbing people, and then like Riker's very reserved about it all. And sorry, I film with cats. I have cats. They are growling. Stop it, you too. Thank you. Sorry.
well. I guess before we go on, the rating's interesting to me. It's 6.5 out of 10.
Oh, I think it should be much higher than that. Well,
Well, the
seven. Well,
first
at least a 7, I would give it.
the first season for a lot of fans, they have some problems with that.
No,
Um,
there are some problems in the first season, but I think this is a particular standout episode of the first season. To
well,
me, just to me.
it's similar to obviously the original series where they had that same episode with the virus, and they make it
No,
actually
and
callback.
I think it was a really smart idea to give it that tie-in. I find that very satisfying that it kind of references TOS. I wish they
And
had
what
done a triple one as well. I know we get a triple one in Deep Space Nine, but I wish that Next Gen had done a triple one. I just thought it was a cute little nod to original series, which I appreciated.
and once again, Riker. Remembering there was a piece of history of
Mm.
Star Trek Enterprise history. Um, I would think Data once again being the large language model back then that oh yeah, this happened on the Enterprise blah 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 on Stardate blah blah
Well,
blah.
I also think though that's just one of those things when people write something for the future and then we move a little bit for the future and we see how much they missed it. Like, I think we're just kind of seeing how much we missed the mark of what a large language model would have been capable of.
Oh yeah, at this point the AI, if you think in 1987, golly, was Microsoft Word even a thing?
Missed the mark in that it's exceeded our
I mean,
expectations.
Word Perfect was around. I'm not even sure if they had spell check yet.
Yeah, I don't know.
In word process. And if they did, it was very archaic. You had
Yeah.
to upload a library,
And not everybody would have had just easy access to it. Not every,
and
yeah.
it would taking you a while. Like this is a time where I guess a little bit later on, I'm in journalism in high school, and we're using the 88 IBM machines, and I don't think we had spell check on the word processors that we were using. I remember this. I was so lazy. because he had to use file names. I would use A, and I didn't know what it was, so I had to like open like multiple times. Like, oh, that's what that one was, and of course I wouldn't change it, wouldn't rename it. I think I did actually write down on a piece of paper that 3 A's was this story or 5 A's was this story. Anyways, so it was a very, I mean, if you think about the computer technology in 1987, um, comparison today, and even by the time it got off the air, how drastic computers had improved by that point. I know this on the original series, when you talk to your Alexa or your Siri or whatever, it's infinitely faster to get data to retrieve information than it was on the original series. They would use computer accessing. Now we just say, Google, where's the Chipotle, and it just pops up like basically instantaneously. So yeah, in a lot of aspects, they didn't quite get a lot of things right.
Yeah, well, in some aspects, we have definitely gone a lot further than. But again, I mean, that's science fiction. What can you, or writing anything kind of futuristic. That's. I also found another really funny moment. I don't know. I don't know if this hit you. So they go over to the ship where this things happened, and they're kind of exploring and looking around. And Jordy literally walks into a room that's all covered in frost, like cold freezer. Everybody's dead, and he totally underplays it. He's just like, "Something's in here," just like
Yeah,
there's like at least a half a dozen dead bodies, and his reaction is just like, "Commander, something's in here." Like it's. I thought that was really like you look at it and see frozen dead people. It. I thought that was funny.
and what Riker remember was someone that was dead in a shower from the Enterprise history, or
Yeah. Someone showering in their clothes, I think.
that's what it was. Yeah. So and again, yeah, I think of all of them, Riker said he was a big Star Trek fan, Jonathan Frakes. And in some ways it shows it with the way that he directs. Maybe he wasn't the greatest actor, but apparently beloved as a director.
No, as a director, he's yeah, really, and they love him. So well done, director Jonathan, I would
And
say.
and even if he wasn't the greatest actor, and I guess that's something we could talk about.
I
Being
mean,
a
on
great,
the one hand, I think he's sort of fine for Riker. What could another actor have done with Riker? I don't know. I mean, do you think Colomini could have done more with Riker? Yes, I do, because I think Colomini is amazing.
oh yeah, today I was just going through flipping on Hulu and had Con Air. Well, I forgot that uh, oh, uh, uh, um, O'Brien's on it, and he is just like every time he's in these movies, he plays hard Irish person that's just powerful and doesn't take any guff from anybody and just
Do
sells
anything. He's so
it.
amazing. And this really doesn't have to do with that, but I recently read 1984. Not a good year to read 1984 right now, but the fact that the character in there is named O'Brien totally helped the sucker punch out for me because I was like immediately I see the name O'Brien, I'm like, oh, it's Chief O'Brien, and I'm like, oh yeah, he meets this O'Brien. O'Brien's like he thinks he's like gonna be against his big government. He's gonna be his helper. O'Brien reaches out to him, I'm like, yes, we got our transporter chief here. It's O'Brien, and then that I was like, oh yeah, it slapped me in the face because
And
again, I saw Colomini.
yeah, he on Hell on Wheels, it just and then also the Great, no, not the Great, no, the Serpent Queen.
Serpent Queen, yeah.
I mean, just solid as a rock, as a king.
Honestly, there's so many times when I see an actor who's under, like maybe they're okay, but they're not that special. And I think, what could he have done with that role? Like, what could Colomini have done with that role? It would have been amazing with him.
Okay, there we get the bridge crew. I don't know if you see the picture or not. Do you see the
I see the
pictures?
picture.
All right, let's rate. Okay, let's put O'Brien in there as well. Okay, let's rate the actors. Patrick Stewart, number one.
I can't say. To me, Patrick Stewart doesn't more than tie with O'Brien. I mean, maybe
Well,
not
what
as O'Brien. I should say Colomini. Like,
what about
I think Colomini could have done what Patrick Stewart did.
okay, Brent Spiner?
Again, I got to give him. He's got to be on the front row. I don't know that I can.
Okay,
In fact, I
so
might even give Brent higher than Patrick.
All right, so we got Patrick Stewart, Brent Spiner, you know, Colin, and then Michael Dorn, top four, or Fadden, or or
When I would have thought of
Jason
him in
McFadden.
next gen, I would not have rated Michael Dorn as well. But when I put that with Deep Space Nine, suddenly Michael Dorn is like pretty amazing.
Okay, we'll do a top five then. Jason McFadden.
Yeah, she's kind of high for me. I think, well, I think what holds Gates back is just the fact that her character leaves in the second season, and then when she comes back, and I don't think she ever truly gets the writing, but when she does, she hits it. I mean, she is a very disciplined, talented actress.
And the rest of them, not that they're, not that Riker's that bad or, Denise
Well,
Crosby's
Riker's
that
fine, but
bad.
I definitely think Riker's under most of the rest of those guys.
But yeah, what I'm comparing is them. Now, again, did Jonathan Frakes have to get better as an actor as time went on because you're most of the time spending time across from, Patrick
Picard.
Stewart, you know, and so like when
Geordi, and again, I love LeVar Burton. I think he's got kind of a good, calm, likable guy energy as Geordi. I think I might put him slightly under the rest of them. And I don't know if I'm being fair. I don't know if that's the writing that he just never really got something to take a bite out of. I find him, I like who he is. I like his energy, but to me, it's always that.
and again, yeah, again, LeVar Burton's not bad. He's
No,
not
he's not
bad,
bad.
but
No.
again, if you go back to the original series, you had Spock, McCoy, and Kirk. They had three, maybe Scotty.
Yeah, it must be kind of William Shatner.
Yeah, well, it
It is.
it is it's some aspects,
It is in the
uh,
in the
if you
action,
think
all the
if you think
aspects.
about it, it is hard to write for 7, 8 people and keep it fair.
No, but you don't have to do that for every episode. This
Yeah.
one's a Scotty episode. This one's a Chekhov episode. But no, they couldn't do that because
Well, as time went on, it became the Brenton Spiner show.
oh, okay, but I don't think that was because Britt.
No,
If anything, Britt was behind the scenes going, "No, give them an episode, please."
yeah, everything
It
is.
it did. But still, it wasn't because Brent was like taking things away from people.
So even as
Even
early episodes,
honestly, I would say you're right. Looking at that, Riker's a little under Geordi, just more. They don't have as much of an arc, but they're fine. Wesley, I think, is really actually good. And when you watch that first season, you might not like him. You might not like that maybe he's being a boy wonder or that he's saving the ship or anything, but it's not because Will Wheaton's a bad actor. I think they assembled a pretty strong cast there. I think they did pretty well for this show that they didn't really expect much out of.
and I guess one question I have for Gene Roddenberry: why didn't they have a chief engineer that was that like a regular person? Because Scotty was such an important part. I mean, the ship propulsing is so important.
And they have some girl in there who's not that good of it. I'm sorry, like she does not stand out. She should not have been a regular chief engineer.
I don't. Well, they went through revolving
She's
chief
relatively
engineers.
forgettable. Just yeah.
Like I don't know if I don't remember if she does another one or not, but I don't think
No,
so.
and they shouldn't. You're right. The chief engineer should be like,
Well,
yeah. So
okay,
yeah.
it should have been Chief O'Brien. That's who
Yes,
it should have
it
been
should have been Chief O'Brien.
instead of a transporter. And I think he was really hired as a glorified extra.
Mhm.
I mean, on the original one, they just call him O'Brien. They didn't call him Chief O'Brien. And in Fire, I call point, I call at Fire Encounter at Farpoint, and I guess they did say
They
there
should
was
have
something.
done a lot more with O'Brien in Next Gen. I mean, and they did some, he marries Keiko and all that, and they have a baby, but like they could have done a lot more with him, and he would have stood up to it big time.
And without him on DS9, without Worf coming over to DS9, it it, it would have
No,
been it
Worf
would have been
saved DS9. Worf saved it.
yes, yes, yes. And again, it wasn't that the other people were bad actors. I mean, they were a powerhouse of talent there.
Oh no, no, DS9 I think has some of the best acting in the Star Trek franchise. Any of it, like DS9 is, oh
But
man,
when Worf came over, it's Klingon. It definitely gave a major lift to DS9. So
and a
uh,
really great arc for Worf because like okay, and I know I'm seeing it from like the kind of more, you know, a different perspective than I think a lot of fans watch Star Trek. I was there for Deanna and Riker and he and I liked Beverly and I had no interest in Worf in Next Gen. but then when I put it together with Deep Space Nine, suddenly he's really one of my favorite characters, and I think has one of the most compelling arcs.
You know, and again, even when I was watching this as a kid, I was thinking, why isn't Worf the chief of security?
I know, right?
You know, that's the obvious choice. And I know with Gene Roddenberry, because, okay, kind of talking about the reason why the first season kind of didn't work. Gene Roddenberry had a non conflict rule for the ship. So you couldn't have conflict with one another. People have been involved enough in human history that they no longer have uh, office space conflict, which, it's not, it's not reality.
No,
But anyway, so
until we get to to broccoli, nobody
so
likes
it
it.
so it made it hard for people to be able to do anything because you had to like agree. It's almost like a no fight rule going on. It's like
So you couldn't have at least very strong differences of opinions. Like it was, and you're right. In dramas and stories, you've got to have conflict. That is what makes it interesting.
in the Super Friends cartoon, because it was Saturday morning cartoons, they had a non-hitting rule. So they had a character called Solomon Grundy, which all he did was hit people. So because he couldn't do it, he was grabbing and hug people. Oh, Solomon Grundy mad. Anyways, so it just a lot of it just couldn't make it worked for what it was, but it just was a pale comparison
But
to the
on the
original
one
movie.
hand, I do agree, and I think that that's what makes DS9 more compelling. Is they do agree. There are characters that don't get along. I wouldn't say there's just like huge death feuds, but there's definitely ones that don't get along as well and ones that get along better. And in a way, it is more dramatic and dynamic and interesting. However, I will say that rule about that everyone has to kind of play nice in next gen, it does give next gen a very cozy atmosphere. It's part of why I think a lot of people love it. Is like you just go there and you're safe, and they're all people you like, and they're all people that you would love to have in your life and would love to have when things are going badly. Like you want these people, you want to be with them, you want them to help. Like it's just such a nice, cozy world. And I think that some of that is because like yeah, they really weren't allowed to get into it very much.
Well, later seasons you had more of that. Not once
To a degree.
once once Gene Roddenberry got out of there, there was more ability for things, and that's why I think in a lot of ways if Denise Crosby would have stayed, I think she would have had more opportunity to do some things. Um,
I think even going, the plot lines she got when she came back in yesterday's Enterprise and all that was pretty amazing. Like, I'm like, if I was going to be an actress, would I want to be a regular on a show and sit there and say hailing frequencies open? Or would I want to just pop in for some of the best episodes of the series and be like, deuces, guys?
I don't know. I mean, in some ways, though, your residual check,
No,
if
no,
you
I'm not
think
talking
about
financially. I'm talking about just.
yeah, if you think about financially, um, a
Oh,
lot of what.
also, maybe you know this more. Picard's in red. Wasn't there a time when Picard went to gold and then he went back to red? Like, I don't. What was
No, I
with Picard in the colors? He was in red in the Naked Now.
yes, yeah. I mean, at this point, they don't really officially say it, but I think this because the idea of having the red shirt on,
But
that
when
you
did he
went
go to
down.
gold?
Okay, all right. So in the original series, gold was command,
Yes.
uh, blue was science, medical, and then red was engineering and security. Okay, which a lot of that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So they didn't say this, but because of the red shirt, I guess Gene Roddenberry decided to flip the colors. So
Yeah,
red
but then
becomes
when does
command.
Picard go into gold? Because there are episodes where Picard's in gold.
No, it's not. There's no scenes where he's wearing gold. He wears a blue outfit when Tapestry happens. Um, Gold is engineering, and he's never other than there might have been a dream sequence that happened that he was in gold, but he's always red. And before that, remember when he was like a cadet, they were still using the um, Star Trek II Wrath of Khan outfits, the coats, without the shirt underneath it. So and when he was on the Stargazer, I think that's what they were wearing, if I remember right. Well, I don't, maybe not. But I know for sure when Jack Crusher dies, they're wearing that outfit. So he's always red. He's always red. There's no gold. I'm trying to think if there was alter. Remember Riker had a gold one when you had Thomas Riker.
Yes.
He had a gold one on. And
Uh,
of course, Worf goes from red to gold because he
there's
goes to.
also a scene, because there's another thing Marina has said that she felt, and I think anyway, that, you know, Troy was a lot of times not helpful and a lot of times didn't really contribute to things in the plot, and she didn't get moments to say a lot of good lines that mattered, that influenced anything. And I thought in The Naked Now there was one little moment when Geordi's there in sick bay and she tells Beverly, she's like, if I didn't know, I would say he's drunk. And I was like, hey, Troy's actually helpful. Like Troy actually, there's a moment, there's something that she says that's what's going on. That's so good job, Troy.
Well, she mentions this, that she was on chopping block because they
Yeah.
didn't like her
Yes.
acting, they didn't
By the
like
end of
her.
the first season.
So the guy, Denise Crosby leaves, and then Beverly doesn't come back, so they couldn't get rid of all the women, so she got to stay by default.
Yeah, because Gates and Tasha left.
If Tasha would have stayed, they probably would have got. And I'll
I
be
don't think
honest.
it was Marina, and they're right. I think they didn't know how to write for Troy.
Oh, that's true.
And I
But I
think
think
you gave this character this power of telepathy that's almost too strong. You've almost got this little superhero, and now suddenly there's so much we can't do if she's around because she would just know it and she would just ruin it. So now we got to find a way to write her out of important scenes. So they didn't really know how to write her. And I don't think they knew how to write this position of ship's counselor. I think it's really unresolved. Like, is she a diplomatic liaison who's counseling Picard? Is she a counselor for crew members, like personally having a hard time? Is she? It was just really unresolved and not clear, and made it really hard for Marina, and got a lot of really waffly writing.
I've not served in the military, but I don't think on any bridges they have a counselor on the bridge.
No, no, no. They have a counselor, but yeah, she's back. Troy, if she's a counselor, like crew member coming, and we do see her doing this. If she's there for crew member well-being and mental health, she would have an office in sick bay by Beverly. Like she wouldn't be sitting
And,
on the.
and then was it the second season when Guinan shows up? She becomes kind of more the counselor
No,
for
she
the ship
does. She
at 10
really
forward.
does. She has some really excellent scenes with people, but it's what Troy should have been doing. Like it, yeah. I mean, I love some of those Guinan scenes, but you're right. She took things away from Troy.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, just having her on there as, you know what, go crazy, make her the science officer. You know,
I think we could have had her with an office in sickbay by Beverly and more of like a Chief O'Brien, like not in every episode, just now like in the broccoli episode where we need someone to talk to a counselor. And maybe she's kind of dating Riker and we see little bits of that from time to time, but she's not really, or full on make her like a diplomatic liaison type officer who really is there for Picard. Like we're dealing with the Ferengi now, or we're having to talk to Klingons, and I need this person to kind of help me with diplomacy. She could sit on the bridge.
well, what they were trying to do is not have it or her, where communication officer, which really that's what she's kind of doing in some aspects. So if you just made her, if you made her a, communication officer that was a telepath, then Captain, I believe he's being false. And again,
But
that
again, and
there's
again, I think it's interesting, and I think the Betazoids are interesting. I think that, but it really is hard to have a character who's a telepath because
yeah,
they
it's
just
like
know too much. There's just too much that you,
it's like a transporter. It has to break down all the time because you can just fix things magically with the transporter.
yeah.
Um, so that was and really that was just mainly a device to keep it where you didn't have to land the shuttlecraft every episode because it got to be too expensive. So yeah, I think okay we talked about okay let's talk about Wesley in here. Um,
In the
and
kind of beginning, I was sort of like he's doing this little science project. I obviously I don't love the end where, I don't have a problem with Boy Wonder Wesley, but I don't like him saving the ship, especially if you were going to have a Wesley saves the day, it really should have been a one-time thing, and it shouldn't have been early in your show. It should have been season 2 or 3. Okay, Wesley, and that's it. That's the time Wesley saves the day, and that's all you get.
They don't even have a picture of him on other than
And
the
that's
group
like at the
photo.
very end of all this, like Picard is like Wesley helped. You're like, did he say Wesley? And I think is it. People
Then
watch this episode. Is it Riker or Worf who comes on and is like, you
the
know,
boy.
Winston Wesley, like is giving him like honors and is I'm like, dude, he's like a what, 14-year-old snot-nosed kid. They wouldn't be like deferring to Wesley, even if he did have like no.
Well, okay, so all right. The plot is basically Geordi sees these naked dead people that are frozen. He touches one of them. He gets infected. Even though they go through the bio thing and the transporter, which of course has to fail. Shouldn't have failed, but it fails. First off, if I wouldn't even send a away team over until I knew that what happened because everybody's dead.
And this is my dad's point. They would have different uniforms and gear for going into different things. And if you were going into a place like that, like you would have had protective gear, hazmats, masks, like you wouldn't have just been walking around in your like street type uniform. Like
Yeah, that makes like no like no sense in some
no sense.
aspects that you're not going to have um, someone that's in safety, you know, uniforms, and they've had that before. They actually the original series when they did this, they were going on their hazmat suits basically, and
Uh,
it and it went through their suit basically. So
and
and
it
you heard that.
happens again in Shades of Grey. Riker goes down to this unknown planet and a plant like pricks him. You wouldn't have gone to an unknown planet in your just street clothes uniform. Like you would have had like if it's an unknown planet, we've never been here. You would have been in full battle rattle, hazmat, masked up, like yeah. So,
All right, so
oh,
Jordy
yeah.
comes back. He's in the he's in the sick bay, and then of course Beverly gets distracted
And he just walks out.
and he just walks out. He's like, "Where did he go?" And the nurse, "Where are you at?" "I don't know." I'm thinking, okay, and then for some reason he takes off his Delta shield.
Well,
So
yeah, he probably knows that's how they could track him.
I guess, but like he's inebriated. It's a like to me that's too convenient. To me that's too convenient.
Oh,
So
see, to me, I would think he would be like, "Oh yeah, I want to walk around, and oh, here's my Delta shield." Anyway, but he does get actually, I thought, a really good kind of dramatic, genuine moment with Tasha where he's talking about how he wants to see like humans and superficially and all the things that his visor can do and how he can see isn't better and he doesn't like that. And I thought it was a very kind of just touching, genuine, well done dramatic moment. Like it wasn't campy. It was I was like, oh, that like for
yeah,
for a campy
yeah.
show and a show that this is kind of a bit of a comedy episode, a bit of a lighter, fun episode. It was just a really beautiful moment.
Yeah, that was good. But he makes his way first to Wesley Crusher's,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And
and
Wesley's doing his
and Wesley's made
tractor
this
beam.
tractor beam, small tractor beam for a science project. Again, great. Cool.
Yeah, I buy that. I buy that.
But so then Wesley uses that to repel people in Brit on the bridge. I'm sorry, in engineering. And then I'm just thinking, surely his science project isn't that good that a Starfleet engineer can't break. And again, that's one of the problems we have is that
Yeah.
we have this lieutenant commander who's you know
But yeah, because were they drunk before he did that? Could they not undo it just because they were so drunk that they were just
I
like,
think Riker. I'm not even sure if the engineer got infected. If she did, it
yeah,
was
infected. They weren't really drunk. It was like an infection that was like,
yeah. So Riker was never completely infected or hadn't responded to the
he
after.
didn't really respond. I was always surprised with that because Troy
So
really gets him, but he stayed.
so uh, and then you have what's I can't remember what it was a crewman blah 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 I can't remember his name, and basically was just playing with the isolinear chips, and then Data could do it.
Yeah, and
It's a
that was
big
Wesley's
game.
idea that Data could do it. I'm like,
What? And then will you finish in time? No. So I thought that was it was funny as all
And
get.
then Wesley's repulsor beam is what gives him more time.
Well, yeah, the idea to push the ship.
So that's a lot of Wesley, like, yeah, no, that's too much. That's too much. Wesley's amazing. And then the end when he gets all like,
Well, I remember also like he was yeah, he recorded Picard's voice. I
yeah,
can send
yes, it's just
I
yeah.
can send any I can pretend I'm on the bridge. Where's the Crusher? Come to the bridge, and then whatever. And so uh, Crusher to the
I'm
bridge.
glad they did not make that mistake in DS9 with Jake and Nog. They're more just regular kids, and sometimes they can do something that's cool, and but they're just regular kids. They're put in their place as regular kids. The
Okay,
people around them
okay.
treat them like an adult would treat a child. They don't like, oh, you're amazing. Like,
So again, did we need set up that the Picard left made sure that that Wesley could not get on the bridge because only officers can be on the
did we
bridge.
have that in Encounter at Farpoint? Yeah, we
Yes,
did.
yes.
Yeah, he
But I'm saying, but he says that, so therefore he has this ability to call people away from stuff that he
and
invented.
again, you say that like it would be unusual. A working bridge on a ship the level of the Enterprise wouldn't allow children, like whether
Or
it was
any
spoken or written, there would be
anybody.
an understanding that the kids don't come. In fact, nobody comes there that doesn't have a reason to be there. Like
If
even a full-grown engineer wouldn't just be up there unless they were doing something engineer-wise. Like,
if you aren't part of the bridge crew, and that's why they had that name
yes,
bridge crew.
you were
Now
not
again,
allowed.
can you be invited up there for a reason? Because like they need to talk
Something,
to a
yes.
counselor
Or
or
if you thought it was cool, kind of like Wesley Encounter at Farpoint, like could be like, oh yeah, come and we'll show you this neat thing, but then you're leaving and you're not coming back. Like,
yeah, you're not sitting at the helm doing anything. I mean,
no.
you're. I mean, if you go back to the original series, the amount of people that was invited to the bridge, was limited. Like Charlie X, like he came on there, and then anyway, so it wasn't that many people coming to the bridge that weren't in Starfleet. But even like this, there's like the crewman that was playing with isolytic ships. There'd be no reason for him to go on the bridge
No, he wouldn't go on the bridge.
unless he had to like had a work detail and had to fix some isolinear chips on there or whatever. But that would be more of a rarity that you're not going to the bridge because that's the center of operations going on. So it's just like uh, some of us. If you got a company, you don't go to the CEO's office and hang out
No,
unless you
no, no,
unless you're
no.
getting unless you're
You
getting
might be there the
invited
first
there.
time you're interviewed or just as a tour of like, okay, but after that, no.
Just like the same thing like the conference room. If you're brought to the conference room, there's a reason why that you're there either for your expertise or you're getting fired or
I've
whatever.
been to my boss's office once. It was when I was interviewed.
Yeah, they went, hey, come on in, say hi, blah blah blah. I mean, even like the years I've been talked about various things, but it's not like
No,
it's not even like once a month.
no.
And there were years that I barely probably even went to anybody's office because there's no reason for me to there's no reason for me to be there. I don't have anything to say. So anyway, so there's a lot of problems. And again, these people that wrote these screenplays, these teleplays, they're not dumb people. They're seasoned writers.
Do you think that the writers knew that and maybe didn't want to go that, but like, do you think it was a little bit of Wesley was Gene Roddenberry's Mary Sue, and Gene Roddenberry wanted him to be this brilliant kid that people deferred to, that like, because there are times when Wesley has a whole freaking bridge crew deferring to him or having meetings about his welfare and future, and I'm like,
I will,
no, his mother would maybe have something to say about his welfare and future. She's, if she talked about it with the captain, it would have been a personal conversation. It wouldn't have been a big meeting in the conference room of like, oh, let's talk about what's going on with Wesley, which doesn't happen in this episode, but it happens in other episodes.
yeah, it's that first season. It was even more so. Now when he finally makes him an acting ensign, which whatever. But when he actually goes to the academy and actually has the red on, that I can accept. That
Yeah, yeah,
he
no,
goes up to
yeah,
that.
I agree. I also think, and again, I hate to say it because I haven't seen it in a very long time, but I'm not sure I really hated When the Bell Breaks being a standout Wesley episode. because they're targeting the kids. Wesley's slightly an older kid that gets targeted. He's kind of a leader to the kids and kind of helps them. That I could go along with. But in this
And well,
episode, it again, can I accept him doing a science project with a tractor beam? Yes. The saving the day stuff,
and Will Wheaton didn't want to act.
no. And he again, all of this is to say my problems with Wesley are not with Will Wheaton. I actually think Will Wheaton does a good job with the material he's given. When I watch it, it is never Wesley's acting that is stinking up an
No,
episode.
and I always find it interesting. Some of the better actors don't want to act at some point. Uh,
Oh, he was a
uh,
kid. So it was like an adult who didn't want to act. He was a child whose parents were like, "You're gonna act."
I saw on TikTok, both the kids from The Sopranos have this podcast. I can't remember the names on there, but you might remember. But the kid, the boy, says he was happy when he got the script and he wasn't in it. And he said that's 3 weeks I didn't have to do anything but just hang out, or it was like
Well,
one line or
kids,
something.
yeah, they want to hang out. I
Yeah,
mean,
and Meadow was opposite. She wanted, want as many lines as possible, but because everything else is going on, she didn't get that much work. But he's ecstatic because he hated memorizing lines, hated doing all these things. So again, I don't know. He's the
and
greatest
interesting back
actor.
then, I don't know, so fans may already know this, but Gates says one of the things they attracted her to do the show was the fact that Will Wheaton was attached and he would had been in Stand By Me, and she was kind of, I don't know, pleased, impressed, but that was definitely a drawing card for her was Will Wheaton.
And could they have picked a better kid actor at the time? I'm thinking
I
probably
don't think they
not.
could have gotten a better kid actor. No,
If you could have waited
honestly,
to,
I wish they had capitalized more on the Crusher Wesley relationship. Like honestly, to be mother and son, and yes, she gets a lot of "I love Wesley," but I think they could have done a lot more and a lot more genuine work on that relationship.
you really don't get a kid actor that's really good until The Sixth Sense.
I
You
don't
know, and that's
know who
and that's
who
'99.
Margaret O'Brien was good.
Well, anyway, I mean,
Jodie Foster was good.
I'm talking from this
Melissa
point.
Gilbert, good. What?
I'm talking from this point, from '87. Like
Oh,
I'm trying to think from that.
I think 87 child actors.
Okay, I'm sure there's okay. Probin Chow 1 and 2, that kid there. I mean, he was mean, but I don't know if he's the greatest actor ever. Urkel, I don't know.
Um, Jodie Sweetin, but again, she was very young at that. She was too young at that time. Actually, the little girl they have, and she's in Deep Space Nine, she's in Next Gen. She plays the little girl who has an imaginary friend. And
Yeah.
actually, both those little girls, but especially the one who had the imaginary friend, not the imaginary friend, but the imaginary friend's good. The little girl who had the imaginary friend, very strong little actress.
What if they would have had Wesley be a girl?
See, I think it's so much Gene Roddenberry's Mary Sue. He wanted this little boy
And
wonder.
I would have fought him, say, Gene, this is a military operation. I do realize there's families on it. Doesn't mean that Wesley can't be a part of something on there, but he can't be on the bridge and he can't be doing stuff that's outdoing people in science
Yeah,
talks.
outdoing them. Yeah.
Like that one episode where he took a science project and gave warp for like 1 second to that broken ship when they were having that contest. That I could give that he knew if you ever use this blah blah blah, you could make that. But first off, how does he get stuff that's so highly reactive that could explode, that can actually give you a warp drive capacity? I don't know. But anyways,
I would
there's
have
a
made it, again, I would have capitalized more on him and his mother. I might have capitalized more on a relationship with Picard and Crusher and how Wesley fit into all of that, more than you're a boy wonder and you're going to save the ship or you're going to do something that just blows all these people's minds and they're just going to defer to you. And no,
now even though Next Generation really isn't an arc show like DS9 is sort of, or Battlestar Galactica
it's
or
a much,
Babylon
much
5,
looser arc, almost
they
no arc. Very.
when Data's on trial, the only portrait he has is of Tasha,
Yeah, yeah.
and
No,
it
and
really
that's
refers to
which
this
starts
episode.
here, the Tasha Data scene, which and that was another note that I had made is they have this scene that seems almost kind of silly and throwaway, and they make a joke about it at the end. But it actually does come back later and really influences, I think, some of Data's character. And like we say later on, you see that he has the picture of her and uh it becomes something that really does is dealt with and processed and helps Data's character to grow.
And it does show that the Bible for the series, or the writers at least were fans or knew knew that well. So when they did the Measure of a Man, they were able to have that callback. I'm trying to think if there's any other big callbacks from
And it
this.
made it like when they found Tasha's sister, I think Data was much more susceptible to her. So I mean, it was important. And when they found Tasha's sister, I think there was like more even than that. Another time when there was a kind of Tasha Data callback.
Yeah. So and that's definitely one that was interesting. And they had her in her. I don't know what hologram they got of what photo they had of her or whatever it was for her for them to use a little hologram, but it worked that in that episode. So yeah, interesting episode. I guess Wesley saves the day once again. Later on, Data saves the day, or Data takes over the ship. That happens like all the time. Anything else in your notes that you want to cover?
Let's see. Yeah, it was again, to me, it was for me a surprisingly good episode. I feel like that one does hold up. I think I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. I think a lot of people like sort of lighter episodes that have a little humor to them. Uh, so yes, good episode. Would recommend.
Awesome. Well, I guess this was one of your picks, right?
Yes, this was a pick for me, so we get to unveil your
Okay.
pick. What?
I will allow you to say no.
Uh-oh, uh-oh, uh-oh.
So to tell you what, let me pull up two um real quick.
I picked
Uh,
this one just because it was light, and I thought it was a good one to kind of get start off. It's light, it was fun. I knew it would be a.
all right. This kind of goes along with some of the other things, and I don't think you ever seen this. I've never seen this.
Oh my gosh, what have we got? What have I done? What are we getting into?
Okay, you ready for the big reveal?
Okay. All right. What?
Cop Rock. Have you ever heard of this?
No.
The
Have you?
plot the plot of this is okay. You ever seen that name Stephen Bosco there? The,
No.
he has done tons of shows. Okay, Hill Street Blues, L.A. Law, Murder One, NYPD Blue. He gave a pitch for Cop Rock, a musical cop show,
Oh
and
my gosh.
ABC went along with it. I've never seen it. I've never seen it.
Are these episodes or is this a movie?
This is episodes. I think it went for like 5 or 6 episodes before they pull it because you can just imagine.
So episode one, season one of Cop Rock. That's our next pick.
I'm just throwing it out.
Okay.
You,
It's on Amazon.
it's on yeah it's on yeah it's on Amazon, so we can watch it. So but you can just look at the cover there,
Oh, my hopes are.
and then a musical adventures of a police force is
Oh my gosh.
is the tagline. Comedy, drama, musical. So yeah, pretty
Okay.
pretty
The pilot
hilarious.
episode of Cop Rock.
Cop. So you've never heard of Cop Rock?
Never, never,
O-
never heard of it.
Okay, Cop Rock. All right. So I won't say more about it. I've always heard of it. At the time I heard it, I think I am not watching this, and I
Oh
wasn't
no,
alone.
that's what I'm thinking, but I somehow I am. Mistakes were made, people. Mistakes were made.
And so if it gets to be so bad that you can't handle it, we can defer to uh, something else. So I just thought that might be kind of good. Well, I guess it's a time. If you enjoy the Random Fandom Zone, please tell some people about this. Real easy website to get to. Not really, but the randomfandomzone.com will take you to the page there. Share it with your friends and whatnot. And I really hope you enjoy this. Let me play the little outro music. So go to www.therandomfandomzone.com for this amazing podcast. You want to be there. Tell all your friends about it as well, and make sure you subscribe. I think I pulled the wrong one up, but you know what? You get the idea. That,
Quality, man. Quality here.
Real quality. So
With
we'll see.
quality.
We'll see y'all next time. And thanks again. If you get some ideas of shows that you want us to do, let us know. We could do some of those as well. So thanks
Love to
again,
hear
everybody.
from you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. We'll see y'all later. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye.